I'm Christine Ahn. I'm the founder and international coordinator of Women Cross DMZ. And thank you for all the people that are joining us via Zoom and as well on Facebook. We have an audience in the room with us here in New York. We're at the UN Church Center across the street from the United Nations. We have a global panel. So we have Yi Jung from the Korean Sharing Movement from Seoul, Dr. Ki Park from Harvard Medical School will be joining us from Milan, and we have an international delegation here with us at the UN Church Center. Today is obviously a momentous occasion with the Winter Olympic Games in Pyeongchang in South Korea. And just an hour ago, the two Korean athletes from North and South Korea marched together into the auditorium carrying the One Korea flag. Obviously the entire audience erupted in applause. And, you know, so the diplomacy that is being put in motion through the Olympic Games is a very hopeful occasion, I think, for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Yet at the same time, we know that Vice President Mike Pence is also at the Olympic Games, and on his way to South Korea, he stopped in Tokyo and reiterated the Trump administration's commitment to push forward and advance its policy of maximum pressure, which we know has included even more stringent sanctions against North Korea, and forcing other countries to cut off diplomatic ties with the DPRK. So in this moment, when we have heard that UNICEF report that up to 60,000 North Korean children could starve as a result of these sanctions, and as this inter-Korean peace process is underway, we felt it was important to have this discussion and to be more informed about how the policies of maximum pressure is impacting the people of North Korea. So just really quickly, Ye Jung wrote to say that she can't hear me. So I'm hoping that other people on Facebook, okay, can hear. Okay, so Ye Jung, sorry that.
She's muted you maybe.
Did you mute me maybe, or?
Mute her computer.
She's muted.
She might have muted her computer.
Okay, well, so let's start. We have quite a bit of ground to cover. And so we'll get started with Dr. Kevin Gray. He's a political economist from the UK, from the University of Sussex, and a leading expert on sanctions. And he's a visiting scholar now at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And Kevin Gray will start us off with an overview of sanctions. So thank you. And please join me in welcoming Kevin.
I'm going to have to adjust the camera
yes,
a bit.
Quite significantly.
Quite significantly.
There
we go.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So I only have, I think, 8 minutes allotted time, so I'm just going to jump straight into it. There's obviously a lot of things to say about sanctions. I will really just talk mainly for reasons of time about the sanctions that have been applied under United Nations Security Council resolutions since about 2006. So those sanctions have been in place for about 12 years now. In terms of the impact of sanctions, I would say probably for about the first 10 years of those sanctions until 2016, the impact was not really massive. And there's two reasons for that. One is that, as was widely reported in the media, that China was fairly lax in terms of the execution of those sanctions. So North Korea was able to trade with China, and of course China also had a booming economy at that time. So like many countries in the developing world, North Korea did pretty well out of exporting mineral resources to China. It also imported, through the foreign exchange that it earned, a lot of the daily necessities that North Koreans needed. But also, if you look at the sanctions themselves, the United Nations Security Council sanctions for about the first decade of their use, they differed quite a bit from the bilateral sanctions that were applied by the United States and South Korea and Japan. So after the Iraq War, as you may be aware, during the Iraq War, you had very, very comprehensive sanctions. Reportedly, a lot of people died. After that, the trend in international sanctions shifted to what they call smart sanctions, which were really centered around things like travel bans on key figures in the regime, on the export of luxury goods, the freezing of assets of key figures within the regime, and of course a ban on dual-use goods that could be used for the nuclear program. But apart from that, they didn't really target the wider economy until about 2016. So things started to change when the UN Resolution 2270, it had a ban on particularly coal exports from North Korea. There was a humanitarian exception, which was a very vague wording that would say that if the trade was for livelihood purposes, it could go ahead. But that was the first resolution in 2016 that started to shift in terms of what it was trying to do. And then later in 2016, even that so-called humanitarian exemption was removed, and there was an explicit target of reducing the export of coal from North Korea. And then more recently, last year, there were even more explicit measures that went beyond the realm of smart sanctions and targeted the wider North Korean economy. So there was a complete ban on coal, on iron ore, seafood, lead, or exports from North Korea. And then last September, another resolution which tried to put a cap on petroleum exports to North Korea. And there was also a textile ban and a ban on new work permits for North Korean workers overseas. So this is quite a significant shift in the nature of UN sanctions over the past 2 years. And at the same time, what we also see is that China now pretty clearly seems to be carrying out and executing those sanctions and being, compared to the past, quite enthusiastic in preventing North Korean sanctions evasion. The extent to which they've actually done that is quite a complex empirical question, but at least the trade statistics show that there's been a significant reduction in China-North Korean trade. So now we have the situation where sanctions are actually having an impact on the wider civilian economy of North Korea, which is a big change from the past. And the humanitarian impact of that, obviously, it has the potential to be quite serious. So if you're going to start reducing energy exports to North Korea, that doesn't just affect the military, but it affects everybody, because everybody uses energy in North Korea. Everybody uses products related to oil, for example. The military probably have ways of circumventing this, stockpiles, which will last a certain amount of time. But generally, ordinary people do not. And the ban on textile exports, I would say, has quite a significant impact as well. One of the ways that North Korea in recent years was getting out of simple dependence on mineral exports was through integration into cross-border regional production networks, outsourcing from Chinese businesses, and particularly women were working in textile factories in North Korea. And so it's obvious that if you ban textile exports, then it's going to affect women's employment in the textile sector. And North Koreans working abroad has grown a huge amount in the last sort of 5 years or so. And China is cracking down on that in accordance, following the UN sanctions. And working abroad, sometimes it's called slave labor in the media, and there are certain practices such as the confiscation of passports and lack of freedom of movement. But there's no doubt that North Koreans want these jobs. They pay bribes to get them because they see it as an opportunity for upward mobility. And for them it is, because they go abroad, they earn money, they bring it back, they tend to invest it. They also bring back goods which are sold in markets. So one of the key mechanisms for upward mobility of a large number of North Koreans has been put an end to it. Now, it's interesting that if you look even at the most recent UN resolutions, they say that these sanctions are not meant to have humanitarian consequences, but they obviously are aimed at doing precisely that. So there's a kind of an increasing contradiction. Now, the question about whether they work or not is a complex one. I mean, we can think about sanctions and where they've been applied and what are the conditions for whether they work. And when we say work, we have to be clear about what work means. It doesn't just mean it has a negative impact on the economy, but it brings about a kind of policy change in the government. There was a study done in the 1980s by a group of scholars who looked at over 100 cases of sanctions applied around the world and looked at in what conditions they were successful and what conditions they were not. And they came up with several conclusions. They said that about 34% of all cases of sanctions had been successful. Just 34%. And they were considered to be the optimists amongst the sanctions specialists. But they had several conclusions, and they said about sanctions would not work in certain cases. One of those was that sanctions would not work when they're too ambitious, when they try to bring about big changes in the government, the target government's policy. So they said that sanctions should be limited in terms of what they try to achieve, otherwise they'd not work. They also looked at the record of sanctions, and they said that they tended to work against countries that were friendly to the country sending the sanctions, but they would not really work against countries that were enemies of the countries. They also said sanctions were not successful in the case where they were applied against autocratic regimes. So they're more likely to work against democracies than what they were against authoritarian governments. They also concluded that sanctions don't work if you just gradually turn the screw over time, okay? If they're drawn out over a number of years, they were not likely to be successful. And basically their argument was that a limited aim of sanctions was much more likely to be conducive. So if we look at their conclusions, we can see in the case of North Korea, they're very unlikely to work. And this is a conclusion that comes from the optimists in the sanctions literature. So the question is then, what is the outcome likely to be then if we continue to apply these sanctions against North Korea in a situation where they're not likely to have much success? And as I've alluded to, the issue is likely to be that they will work in the sense that, work is in quotation marks, they will work in the sense that they'll produce considerable hardship for the North Korean people. But even as the sanction specialists themselves tend to argue, that they're very unlikely to bring about the change in North Korean government policy that they're looking for. So I think I've run out of time, but I think we'll have a Q&A session after this, so I can come back to some of these issues. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. And now we will turn to South Korea. We'll have Yejung Yi, who is the policy director for the Korean Sharing Movement, which is the largest organization in South Korea that has provided, can you hear me okay, Yejung? Humanitarian aid in North Korea, especially during the Sunshine Policy year. So I will turn over to Yejung. And Yejung, are you ready to go? I think she has a PowerPoint.
She knows how to share her screen.
She knows, okay, great. But I can't hear her for some reason.
Should be able to hear you.
Okay, Yejung, can you speak?
Yeah, now I can
Okay.
hear you.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Uh-oh. Christian, can you hear me? Jacqueline, can you hear me?
I think you
Can you try speaking?
We muted her.
Yejung? She's muted herself. Can you try speaking?
She can't seem to hear you.
I don't know why. Can you hear us, Yejung?
Can she see us?
Yejung, can you hear us? We can't hear you. We cannot hear you. Can you speak?
How about now?
Yes.
Yeah,
She must
okay.
have muted herself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Christine, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Hello everyone. My name is Yejong. I'm really poor at this kind of technology. I'm sorry. Today, I'd like to talk about the South Korean NGOs' assistance to North Korea and why it's important in terms of peace building of the Korean Peninsula. So, as you know, a severe famine hit North Korea in mid-1990s, and the estimated number of deaths varies from 300,000 to 3 million. Actually, we don't know the exact number of victims, but the impact of famine is still alive in North Korean society. As you know, in 1995, North Korean government, they appealed for the first time to International Society for Food Aid, and the international community, they quickly responded to it. And also South Korean society quickly organized nationwide movement to help North Korean people. Actually, before this movement, South Koreans, they saw North Korean people just as enemy. But ironically, because of this tragedy, this famine, South Koreans finally realized that North Koreans are our sisters and brothers. And of course, for the first few years, we focused on food aid and emergency relief. But around the year of 2000, South Korean NGOs, we changed our strategy from emergency relief to sustainable development and mid long-term programs. Since then, many sectoral projects were conducted in North Korea. The sectors include agriculture, livestock, breeding, medical and health, and nutrition, and other various sectors. Of course, these assistance programs help North Korean people to have better life. But here, I'd like to emphasize that these programs also promoted people-to-people engagement between the two Koreas. For example, for the past 20 years, Korean sharing movement alone visited North Korea 550 times, and more than 6,500 South Koreans, they visited North Korea through KSM channel. Of course, the first objective of our work is to alleviate North Korean people's hardship and enhance their living condition. But in addition to this, with South Korean NGOs living still in unended war, we really hope our work can contribute to the peace on the Korean Peninsula. As already mentioned, South Korean NGOs promoted inter-Korean cooperation and exchanges and people-to-people engagement. And we believe this led to mutual understanding and trust and reconciliation. Actually, South Korean NGOs, we help to maintain momentum for dialogue and cooperation between the two Koreas, even when the government level relationships were deteriorated. But actually, those are the story of first 10 years of our work. For the last 7-8 years, South Korean NGOs activity significantly shrank. due to the bad relationship between the two Koreas and escalating tensions in Korean diaspora. As you can see in the table, from around 2008, the volume of South Korean assistance to North Korea and number of South Korean visitors to North Korea dropped sharply. What is important is that these trends exactly coincide with the peace and stability of the Korean Peninsula. Actually, last year, the National Assembly Speaker's Office, they conducted a survey. One of the questionnaire was, what are you most afraid of? The second majority answer was war. People of South Korea, we are so-called OECD member country, but we are still afraid of war. That's our reality. Of course, we know that our cooperation program and people-to-people engagement cannot solve all the tangled problems of Korean Peninsula. But I believe if we had maintained a certain level of civil cooperation between the two Koreas, the situation would have been better than we witnessed over the last few years. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the future assistance and cooperation of South Korean NGOs. Actually, the reason why South Korean NGOs assistance and cooperation programs suspended for the last 7-8 years was caused by the inter-Korean relationships, not sanctions. But when South Korean NGOs resume their programs, current sanctions regime will definitely affect their works. Recently, a South Korean NGO tried to provide some volts and nuts with TB medicine, but they cannot send them. Also, as you already know, a US NGO container got caught in China due to a nail clipper, which was mistakenly included in the container. It seems like all metal items are not allowed to ship to North Korea, even though those are essential parts of their projects. In this situation, can South Korean NGOs send rice transplanters, construction materials, medical equipment, or any other sophisticated items? I'm afraid that's not possible. Actually, South Korean government, they say they will proceed humanitarian assistance, but within the framework of current sanctions. And also, South Korean NGOs, we have been asking for special measures for assistance to North Korea, but it doesn't seem enough. As you know, we South Korean NGOs cannot solve this problem alone, and any one international NGO or organization neither. So I believe it's time to cooperate each other. Fortunately, many organizations in and outside of Korea agree that we should work together on this issue. So for example, yesterday I had a meeting with a US NGO and we discussed how to organize future actions with other organizations and how to cooperate on this issue. So my message today is very simple. Of course, in order to end the crisis of Korean Peninsula and bring peace, we need some systems and agreements, such as a peace treaty. But without mutual understanding, without inter-Korean exchange and cooperation, without people-to-people engagement, peace cannot be sustainable, and peace treaty might become a piece of paper. So in this regards, assistance programs, cooperation programs by South Korean NGOs and other international organizations is the process of mutual understanding and also the practice to live together. So I believe we should try to promote people-to-people engagement along with the efforts to change the system. Okay, thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ye-Jung, for joining us so early in the morning, or late at night, actually. So next we have Henri Ferran, who is a legal scholar from Columbia University, and he's going to give us a perspective on how the sanctions are impacting human rights. Thank you, Henri.
So, hello. So I was asked to examine whether UN sanctions against North Korea violate human rights. The basic argument would be that the economic damage caused by sanctions interferes with North Korea's...
Speak louder, please. Microphone is down. Sorry, what's that? Speak louder now.
Okay. So the basic argument would be that the economic damage caused by sanctions interferes with North Korea's ability to protect the human rights of its citizens. Note that North Korea officially challenges the legality of the sanctions on other grounds than human rights. The argumentation focuses on the rationale rather than the consequences of sanctions. North Korea contends that the singling out and prohibition of its nuclear program by the Security Council constitutes an abuse of power under the Charter and violates North Korea's right to self-determination and self-defense. Now, I cannot address all legal arguments against the sanctions in the 8 minutes I was given, so I'll focus on human rights. Please bear in mind that even so, the presentation remains an exploratory discussion in which I have to omit some nuances. With that said, note that a human rights argument requires a two-step reasoning. First, I will debate whether sanctions violate human rights, and then I have to address a related question, namely whether the Security Council has authority to adopt sanctions violating human rights. So first, do the sanctions actually violate human rights? The Special Rapporteur for DPRK Human Rights, Tomás Ojeo Quintana, recognized that the sanctions could have an impact on North Korean human rights in its September 2017 report to the UN General Assembly. He recommended, I quote, that the United Nations conduct a full assessment of the impact of the Security Council sanctions regime on human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with a focus on the extent to which the sanctions may put livelihoods at risk. Now, in my view, economic sanctions impact several well-recognized human rights that can be found in the two core human rights treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In the first covenant, the right to life stands out. And in the second, on socioeconomic rights, the most directly relevant ones are the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to be free from hunger, and the right to health. Also relevant is the right to development that was proclaimed in a 1986 General Assembly resolution. The sanctions have implication on rights through their impact on North Korea's ability to earn foreign currency, but also on the ability of external actors to provide aid, as other presentations on this panel make clear. The sanctions clearly interfere with North Korea's economic development, for instance, by limiting oil supplies. They interfere with the sale of its most sought after commodities, especially minerals, textiles, and seafood, especially since recent sanctions, as Kevin has mentioned, removed humanitarian exceptions. They interfere with North Korea's access to foreign capital, with measures complicating international bank transactions and the formation of joint ventures. They interfere with the importation of critical elements for North Korea's energy, telecommunication, agriculture, and healthcare sectors, to name a few. And they interfere with the work of humanitarian organizations that try to protect the most vulnerable sectors of North Korean society. In this sense, the sanctions can be said to have a significant impact on the right to life, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to food, the right to health, and the right to development of the North Korean people. As to whether the impact of these rights amounts to a violation, it's important to note that the practice of international human rights law generally focuses on the responsibility of a state in violating the rights of its own citizens, rather than on the responsibility of a third party, like the Security Council. It would be unorthodox to hold a third party responsible especially since the Security Council is not, as a body, part to the human rights covenants. On the other hand, note that nearly all UN members have ratified both covenants, with the notable exception of China and the United States. Moreover, third-party responsibility does not appear incompatible with the spirit or letter of the covenants, as their preambles call for universal respect and observance of human rights. Finally, it could be argued that the relevant rights have become part of customary international law and therefore bind all international legal personalities. In this sense, it could be argued that the Security Council, by the impact of its sanctions, is violating the human rights of North Koreans. One counter-argument would be that North Korea also violates the rights of its citizens. However, that is not a valid legal justification for the Security Council to do the same. It's a political rather than legal argument. That brings me to the second part of this presentation, which is whether the Security Council will be violating the Charter by adopting sanctions violating human rights. It may seem at first glance that the Security Council has clear authority under Chapter 7 of the Charter to adopt economic sanctions. Chapter 7 allows the Security Council to take measures to maintain or restore international peace and security when it determines that there is a threat or breach of the peace. As far as Security Council sanctions against North Korea are concerned, the accusation is that the nuclear program is a threat or breach of the peace, not of the nuclear program of North Korea, but not of other states. And the sanctions are meant to maintain or restore international peace and security by convincing North Korea not to join the nuclear club. Chapter 7 explicitly authorizes the Security Council to call upon UN members to completely or partially interrupt economic relations with a country. Sanctions against North Korea amount to a partial interruption of economic relations, as some lesser commodities are not included yet in the sanctions. Thus, the sanctions appear conform to the provisions of Chapter 7. However, the authority of the Security Council must be exercised also in conformity with Chapter 5 of the Charter. Chapter 5 notably provides that the Security Council must act in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN. It can hence be argued that a Security Council resolution that is contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN is ultra-virus, that is to say that it is an abuse of power and that it has no binding effect on UN members. There would be no point in writing limits on the power of the Security Council if it could violate those limits with impunity. Now, the purposes and principles of the UN includes international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights. In this sense, it can be argued that Security Council resolutions that violate human rights are contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN, and therefore constitute an abuse of power. One counter-argument would be that allowing challenges of Security Council resolution on the basis of human rights would open the floodgates to challenge all sorts of resolutions, but that again is a political rather than legal argument. So I therefore conclude on the basis of this exploratory review that it's possible to challenge the legality of Security Council sanctions against North Korean human rights grounds. Unlike North Korean arguments, which directly go for identifying UN purposes and principles violated by the UN sanctions, a human rights-based argument requires a two-step reasoning. First, identifying or determining whether the Security Council or its members have violated human rights norms by the third-party interference of North Korea's economy. Activists can weigh in on the debate by collecting evidence of the direct impact of sanctions on North Koreans, especially their life, standard of living, health, food, and economic development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henri. That was right on time. Somebody is a very disciplined legal scholar here. Now we will listen to Yifat Suskin. She's the executive director of Madre. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times. She's a commentator for CNN, but she's just a renowned feminist. And we're just really honored to have Yifat share with us, because Madre has had a long history of sending and providing humanitarian aid to the women and children in Iraq. So Yifat is going to give us that perspective. So thank you, Yifat. You're going to have to probably adjust that.
Just a little.
Everybody will have to.
Just a little.
Yeah, I know. It's embarrassing.
So thank you. I can't say that I'm a disciplined legal scholar, but I will try to stick to time. Yeah, Madre is a global women's rights organization. And so Christine had asked me to share a little bit, some lessons from our mobilizations against the sanctions and war on Iraq that might serve us as we're trying to address the crisis on North Korea today. And I guess I'll say that a lot of what we are hearing from my colleagues on the panel right now about North Korea really was foretold by what we saw during the sanctions on Iraq. And I want to hone in on one point that I think is really important, which is that we need to emphasize, especially to US audiences, that the sanctions on North Korea are not a peaceful alternative to military intervention. That, I think, is how people understand them, and therefore why people support them, because they feel like that's the dichotomy that's available to us. What we need to emphasize, I think, is that sanctions are not a peaceful alternative, because as we're hearing, they inflict disease and hunger and tremendous suffering on the most vulnerable people in North Korea. And that is based on the experience of the Iraq sanctions and on the experience of more than a dozen other countries that were sanctioned by the Security Council throughout the 1990s, a known outcome of the North Korea sanctions. And that's why they are considered to be a violation of international law, or rather of human rights. I think that, in particular, when we talk about the humanitarian exemptions that exist in the sanctions regime, we should understand that those function a lot of the times to sort of whitewash rather than to prevent the suffering that is actually happening. And that's another message that I think we really need to get out to US publics. Now, having said that, I think there is a scenario in which we might consider supporting sanctions, and that is one in which progressive civil society within a country is itself calling for sanctions. So we saw that in South Africa in the 80s. That's arguably the case in Palestine right now. So we can evaluate that case by case as people who care about peace and justice, but we should make no mistake that the North Korea sanctions very much fit the more common pattern that we saw in Iraq, which is that they are ineffective in their stated aim, at least, of changing government policy, and they're unethical. Now, back in the 90s, what Madre did during the Iraq sanctions was to organize a campaign that we called Milk and Medicines. And through that campaign, women peace activists from the US and the Middle East drove a convoy of trucks across the desert from Amman, Jordan to Baghdad, and hand-delivered 10 tons of humanitarian aid to nurses and doctors in Iraq. And it was a very powerful and visible form of solidarity. I think that the lesson for us today, not necessarily to replicate that exact model of popular aid, though I think we can look for strategic openings to do so if we have them. I think the lesson of Madre's Milk and Medicines campaign is to find ways to generate the same kind of people-to-people engagement that can transcend the belligerence of our governments. And I think we have a really powerful model for that kind of engagement in the work of Women Crossing the DMZ. So if you don't know that organization and their history and what they're doing, I invite you to learn more about them. It's really, really important for us right now. Another lesson of what Madre and many other peace groups did in the 1990s was to try to unmask the language that we remember from the buildup to the Iraq War of collateral damage and shock and awe that really served to mask the brutality of what the US was doing. And today we need to interrupt euphemisms like this bloody nose attack that so distort the reality of what they're actually proposing to do. And we need to remind people that to describe a bombing that risks a species-level nuclear disaster as a mild injury is not just euphemistic, it is so abstracted from reality that it should sound deranged. But when people hear the same thing over and over again from policymakers, from pundits, we become desensitized to the reality of that language. And it is worth pointing out to people also how gender is operating here. Women peace advocates, we know, are systematically dismissed by policymakers. We saw that in Iraq. We're seeing it on Korea right now. And, you know, there's this stereotype that men are sort of rational and clear-eyed and women are emotional and can't face the hard realities of war. We're all familiar with that. But who is more disconnected from the realities of war than people who are describing a bombing that could trigger a nuclear war as the bloody nose? And who understands more about the realities of war than women, who are responsible for caring for the most vulnerable people in wartime, and then for providing lifetimes of care to people who are traumatized and bereaved and poisoned and disabled. Those are the hard realities of war, and women know them very well. And it's one of the reasons why, as Women Crossing the DMZ has been saying, we need women's perspective. We need that perspective, which men can also bring, of course, in negotiations. I think that we, as we try to sort of bring home the real life lessons of what the sanctions are doing on North Korea, we need to present the kind of data that my colleagues on the panel have been presented. That is crucial to policymaking. But we should also understand that public opinion is made out of stories. So we don't only do that with language like embargoed textile exports. We also need to tell those stories that Kevin was alluding to of the women factory workers whose children are wasting away because of the sanctions. That's incredibly important to do, and we should be thinking about how we do that today and how we overcome some of the barriers, for example, the lack of access that journalists have to those stories. So what is the role of artists right now in telling those stories and really enabling people here to understand what is happening? I think the last thing that I want to say is that we have an opportunity right now that we didn't have after 9/11 and during the build-up to the Iraq War, which is to do this work on Korea as part of the broader fabric of incredibly vibrant social movements that are active right now. I think that we should be asking ourselves how we can learn from the climate justice movement, for example, about how we help people confront an existential threat like nuclear weapons without overwhelming them with fear. What can we learn from racial justice activists and from feminists about how white supremacy and patriarchy are fueling US militarism on Korea right now? I think we need to understand how all of these issues interrelate and how we act in real solidarity across the different movements that we're engaged in. And that doesn't mean that we all have to be experts on everything, but it does mean that we need to understand how the expertise that we're holding and the deep and really specialized focus that we should have as experts, how that piece relates to the piece next to it. And I think that if we can do that and support the leadership of women peace advocates on Korea, that we have a chance of succeeding in this mobilization for maximum engagement and hopefully preventing a war. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ifat. You really brought a very important perspective to this conversation. So thank you so much for, and here we go. I had to lower the screen. So we have 2 more speakers, and can you see what an amazing all-star panel we have? And we have hundreds of people joining us on Facebook and via Zoom. So thank you, everybody, for sharing your wisdom and expertise. We have 2 more speakers. Our next speaker is Doug Hostetter from the Mennonite Central Committee. They have a longstanding humanitarian operations program in the DPRK. And so he's going to give a perspective. And then lastly, we'll hear from Key Park, and then we'll have a round of Q&A. So Doug, and I'm going to put this here so that the audience can hear you. Yes, there we go. And I'm going to reset.
Thank you very much. The Mennonite Central Committee has been active in North Korea for 22 years now. We went during the time of the famine in the mid-90s, and after the immediate emergency was over, they asked us to remain on to continue to do various kinds of relief and development work. We've done a variety of things. For the past 5 years, we've been very active in 13 different orphanages and 3 collective farms, working in sustainable agriculture with the collective farms and with the orphanages, working with nutritional work. We've built a soy milk factory in North Korea, to which we ship soybeans, which are then converted into soy milk, which is then used in the orphanages, which we have been supporting. We have also been exploring with a number of pediatric hospitals. We have been supporting partner organizations that work with TB victims in North Korea, and a variety of other kind of ways. We have discovered that since the beginning of the year, things have significantly changed for humanitarian organizations. And let me be clear, I totally agree with Yvette and other speakers who have said North Korean people. We cannot make up for all of the harm that is being done by the sanctions, which is blocking the ability of the Korean government and the Korean people to make their own living. But during the past 22 years, as a way of building understanding, as a way of doing help and people-to-people work, we do believe that this kind of work is really critical, especially at a time when the US government has cut off essentially all other avenues of communication. One of the partner organizations we work with wrote to me recently and said, "We are now in perhaps the most extreme situation ever within the last 22 years of work in the DPRK with regard to tensions, sanctions, and related restrictions. Beginning of 2017, we have faced the challenges of external tax that affects our everyday transactions, from shipping, banking, purchasing, Chinese customs clearance, travel permissions, etc. We are doing our best to navigate these challenges. However, our staffing level remains the same, so that additional demands have increased the burdens on our staff. We are trying to maintain the same level of support in our centers. However, only time will determine whether or not we are able to do this." Let me just read a couple of the examples of some of the difficulties that MCC and our partner organizations have run into. Under Section 7 of the latest UN Resolution 2397, industrial machinery, transportation vehicles, iron, steel, and other metals are prohibited from being supplied or transported to the DPRK. There does not appear to be an exemption to this provision, except for special case-by-case exemptions by the UN Sanctions Committee, paragraph 25, Resolution 2397. And it is unclear if such exemptions are available to individual NGOs and what mechanisms would be in place for them to secure those exemptions. Let me just give you an example from just the past month. We Mennonite churches, Sunday school classes across Canada and the US work together to put together health kits as a way of helping American children and families understand some of the things that are needed in North Korea right now. They are composed of a towel, some soap, a toothbrush, and nail clippers. Unfortunately, we now have a container in China that has 2,000 health kits that are destined for the pediatric hospitals that we have been working with. These health kits cannot go through because they contain metal. The nail clippers are metal, which are prohibited by the last UN resolution. The Chinese Central Customs agents have been blocking 2,000 health kits put together by American families and congregations, Sunday school classes, to help the children in North Korea. International banks and related third-party suppliers and customers, shippers and insurers must be legally assured that their transactions in connection and on behalf of humanitarian agencies are explicitly protected. We have been working for 22 years. We have been buying supplies from China for 22 years for TB clinics, for the hospitals that we work with. Suddenly, within the last 2 months, the suppliers that have been supplying our medical supplies in China that we have been buying from decades will no longer receive international transfers of funds to buy supplies for shipment to North Korea. We need to solve the issues of the sanctions. But even while we are solving the issues of the sanctions, we need to make it possible for humanitarian organizations like the Mennonite Central Committee to continue with their people-to-people work and their humanitarian aid to the people of North Korea. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. So we have our final panelist today, who is zooming in from Milan, and he's Dr. Key Park. He is the, excuse me, this is aging. He's the director of the DPRK programs for the Korean American Medical Association. He's also the Paul Farmer Global Surgery Scholar at the Harvard Medical School. And he also works as consultant with the World Health Organization to ensure the timely and safe emergency and essential surgical care at the district level hospitals in developing countries, including North Korea. So before I hand it over to Dr. Park, I wanted to just quickly remind everybody that we will have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. We have members of the audience here at the UN Church Center who should also be crafting your questions. And we also have received a few questions via email, but please post your questions either on Facebook or on the Zoom platform. And so thank you, Dr. Park. We're ready to hear from you.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this really important dialogue. As Christine mentioned, I am the director for the North Korean program at the Korean American Medical Association, which represents 20,000 doctors in the US of Korean heritage. We work with the North Korean Medical Association, officially called the Chosun Medical Association. And since 2007, we've visited North Korea over 18 times and treated countless patients alongside our North Korean colleagues. And our mission is to improve the health of North Korean people. And we do that by educating and training the medical staff. We build research capacity, we increase the inflow of medical information into North Korea, and we facilitate the participation of North Korean doctors within the international medical community. I often get asked, what's it like to work in North Korea? So let me just give you a short anecdote. This was on my second trip to North Korea. I was allowed to perform surgery at the Pyongyang Medical College. I'm a surgeon. I wash my hands with a bar of soap and douse them in alcohol. This very small nurse gave me a perfectly folded gown to wear. And when I looked closely, these were disposable paper gowns that had been cleaned and re-sterilized. Now, all my North Korean colleagues were wearing cloth gowns. They had thought that as an American surgeon, I would be more comfortable in a paper gown because that's what we use in the US. Well, the truth is I actually prefer cloth gowns, but I didn't say anything because I saw that they were trying their best to make me feel comfortable. It turns out the nurses always opened the best instruments whenever I was operating. Then one day, as I tried to make an incision, the skin did not open, divide as I made the cut. So I looked at the scalpel carefully, and it was brown with rust. My North Korean colleague, surgeon, standing across the patient from me, quickly chided the scrub nurse and said, "You should have opened a fresh scalpel for Dr. Park." It was a very awkward moment. Then I said, "이렇습니다," which means in Korean, "no problem." And then, of course, the OR staff broke out in laughter and closed the case, finished the case in smiles. There's another case where it's a lengthy operation to remove a brain tumor. And the operation was 4 hours long. And during the entire 4 hours, one anesthesiologist was maintaining respiration for the patient throughout the entire operation. That's 20 times a minute of his hand squeezing a black balloon. That's 5,000 times he did and never complained. They don't have mechanical ventilators in North Korea. There are many more examples of scarcity of supplies and equipment. For example, they use beer bottles to hold intravenous fluids. They rewash and use gauze. Overhead lights typically don't have all the light bulbs in there. And the suture needles to close the skin are typically dull and then threaded by hand. What impressed me the most by working with North Korean doctors was their attention to detail. And they do have a true desire to do the best for their patients despite the conditions. And we can really relate on this level. North Korea guarantees free healthcare to all of its citizens. Universal health coverage is written in their constitution. You may be surprised to know that North Korea actually spends 6.5% of their GDP on health. That's about $40 per person per year. That proportion is higher than Philippines, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. And what surprised to me is that over the last 10 years, despite the nuclear weapons program, the spending on health has risen during this period. But as the stories show, the North Korea struggles to provide healthcare due to scarcity of supplies and failing infrastructure. The ever stricter sanctions have had a profound effect on foreign aid to North Korea. The foreign aid to North Korea is now at $37 million total. This is one-tenth the amount that was given 15 years ago. Per person, that comes out to be $1.5 per person. And when you compare this aid to, let's say, countries like Vietnam, they're receiving $26 per person, and Myanmar is receiving $68 per person. And this is getting worse. Last year, New Zealand stopped all humanitarian aid to North Korea, and just 2 months ago, UK government announced it was cutting off all humanitarian aid to North Korea. So not only is the humanitarian aid funding being cut, but as you heard from the other speakers, aid agencies are experiencing extraordinary difficulties in actually delivering aid. For example, banks are refusing to handle transactions, and logistics companies are avoiding shipments to North Korea. As a result, life-saving medications and medical supplies are not reaching the needed population. So some people have asked me if I've seen any evidence that sanctions are actually hurting North Korean people. And I think this is a wrong question to ask, because by the time we start seeing increased mortality rates of children and mothers being reported, thousands would have died already. Just last month, UNICEF reported that 60,000 North Korean children face starvation unless aid is restored. There's an oath which doctors take which may apply at this point. In Latin, it's called primum non nocere. It means first do no harm. I understand the UN Security Council has a responsibility to maintain international peace and security. However, the members of the UN Security Council have failed to protect the most vulnerable people in North Korea. And I do hope that we can act together in ensuring the needed humanitarian aid is delivered to these people. I can't stay on for the rest of this engagement because I have a previous meeting, but I do look forward to watching the recording and working with all of you. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Park. It's been invaluable to have your perspective and obviously those touching stories of your operations in North Korea. Dr. Park, can you stay for some quick questions, or do you?
I could try, yes, until they come and get me.
Okay. Well, just maybe one question. from the audience. Or actually, no, sorry. Has any, actually, this is probably for Kevin and also for Dr. Park, so maybe quickly if you have a response. Has any economist accounted for the number of deaths attributable to the lack of related? Do you have a quick response to that, Dr. Park?
I don't hear the question, Christine, sorry.
Okay, the question is, any data that can estimate the number of deaths caused by the instability of medicine and nutrition caused by sanctions in the DPRK?
I'm not aware of any data at this point, but as I alluded to, I think by the time we get this data, it's too late. People have died.
Okay, Kevin doesn't have any questions. Okay, Dr. Park, we'll let you go because I know that you have to head off. But thank you. It was a real pleasure to have you, and we will continue to take some more questions. But I asked the question from the audience, or from the people that have sent in the messages via email. Do we have some quick questions from the audience? Well, as you formulate your questions, why don't I just quickly read some of the questions that have come in via email. One question is about this maximum pressure. And this is from Elizabeth Davis from the Win Without War program. And she asks, she has a series of questions. Can shining a light on the human side of North Korea lead the US to reconsider its views on the use of preventative strike strategies over the use of diplomacy? What has been the humanitarian impact of the current sanctions regime? I think we have, all of our panelists have addressed that pretty well. And are international sanctions hurting the regime or the majority of North Koreans? Again, I think many of you have responded to that. But maybe if anybody has a quick response to that question. Anybody want to come up to the podium to respond to that? Kevin? Okay, great. Okay. Adjusting again. I need to get some higher heels or something. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, just on the first point about the whether showing the human side of North Korea can sort of help in some way to counteract the maximum pressure campaign. I think it definitely can, because I think what we've seen for many years, actually, particularly in the media, is a kind of a demonization of North Korea. This kind of constant message that it's worse than any kind of authoritarian regime that exists out there, and it's kind of in many ways, I think it's a preparation for military action. It's one of the things that gets the public in the right mind to support a military strike against North Korea. And what we get, constant images of the Kim family, which is in some ways reflects actually the North Korean media as well, but this assumption that that's all North Korea is, and that real people don't actually live there, or they're terribly oppressed. So I think it's true that one of the ways that this message, this kind of propaganda campaign that's preparing the American and Western populations for war, one of the ways that can be counteracted is through showing the human side. And the fact that there are 23 million people who live in North Korea, right? And it's often what we see in the media would not affect that. So I agree with that. The other question was about, are the sanctions hurting the regime or the people? And of course, we've talked about the human side of that, but are the sanctions affecting the regime? And I think it's, in any country, the state and society cannot be separated easily. The state is dependent on the economy for its resources, and people depend on the state in certain ways. If people want to trade in the market or they want to sell things or open up a business, they'll need to pay money to officials or particular members of particular state organizations. There's no real way that sanctions can simply target the regime and not target the people, or even vice versa. That doesn't work. That's not realistic. The question is, of course, whether you, by squeezing the economy so hard, you can sort of force the government to change its policies and drop its nuclear weapons program. I think that's highly unlikely. The North Korean regime is fairly united in the idea that it needs to have nuclear weapons. It's different from the case of Iran, for example, which has, you know, in some ways there are different political camps there. There are different opinions over nuclear weapons. In North Korea, nobody's ever sort of identified any splits within the elites over nuclear weapons. So there's a kind of unitedness over the issue of weapons. And also we remember that North Korea went through a very terrible famine in the 1990s. Many people died. But at no stage was there any pushback against the regime. The regime was, the government was, there was no popular protest. There was nothing like that. So even if we go back to the economic stress of the 1990s, there's absolutely no guarantee that the state will respond or will drop its nuclear weapons program. And when you talk, you know, we're talking about things like bloody nose strikes, how does that persuade the North Korean government to drop its nuclear weapons? Okay, if somebody is afraid of being attacked and you threaten to attack them, that's not going to change what they view as being their kind of last line of defense. I mean, the whole reason they developed nuclear weapons in the first place. So yeah, so those are a few disconnected thoughts on those questions. I'll stop. Thank you.
I actually have a question for Yejang. So Yejang and I were together in Vancouver a few weeks ago when the US and Canada co-convened a meeting of the foreign ministers to talk about the North Korean nuclear crisis. And what we learned afterwards, this was leaked to the Japanese press, was that Kang Kyung-hwa, the South Korean foreign minister, had brought into the discussion resuming humanitarian aid from South Korea. We know that Moon Jae-in at the UN General Assembly last fall made a pledge to send $8 million worth of humanitarian aid from South Korea. And we learned from the leaks to the Japanese media that she was blocked. It was highly, she faced a lot of opposition from the US delegation, from the UK delegation, and the Japanese delegation. And so I would love to hear from Yejang how she thinks that these ongoing sanctions will impact the efforts now, especially with the incredible inter-Korean peace process that has been sparked by the Olympics, how she views the ability of South Korean, either the NGOs or even the official government assistance in supporting the people of North Korea. So Yejang.
Actually, we know that South Korean, can you hear me? Okay. Actually, South Korean government, they really want to proceed humanitarian assistance and even development assistance to North Korea. And this Pyeongchang Olympics is really, really good opportunity to proceed that kind of thing. But the thing is, this sanctions regime, as I already mentioned, actually they say they're going to stick to the framework of sanctions. So that means they actually don't have room to, how can I say, move freely. You know what I mean? I mean, even though they want, they don't have any measures to proceed that kind of thing. So maybe they're gonna, they want us NGOs to go first. That's their strategy. And actually many South Korean government officials, they asked us to go ahead and actually with South Korean NGOs, we have KNCCK, a council of 57 NGOs providing assistance to North Korea. nowadays we are working on our future assistance program with North Korea, but we are still very worried about the current sanctions regime. So as I already said, we need to work together internationally. We South Korean alone cannot solve this problem, and yeah, we should work on it together.
We have, I think Henri Ferron had wanted to have a response to one of the questions. So Henri, sorry, this is a very clunky system here, but we're doing the best that we can.
Yeah, so just a quick comment again on the utility of shining light on the human side in North Korea. Activism in this case is critical because although I presented a legal case, basically a legal argument, I mean, this will not be news to many listening in, but the key problem of the international legal system is enforcement. And in this context, the key enforcer is the Security Council. So if you want to take the Security Council to account, the question is, how do you sue the policeman? And the key, well, the institution that would be the judge, or that is theoretically thought of being the judge in the international legal system, is the International Court of Justice. However, to my knowledge, there has never been a case where the International Court of Justice has directly challenged the Security Council. And in this sense, don't count on a legal case to change the game. The key here is activism, and law should only be used as a line of argument by activists. It still has a moral power to it, but it ultimately relies on people making that argument. Thank you.
Great. So we have about we have several hundred people listening on Facebook, and if you have questions, please post them now. I'll quickly take. We have about less than 10 minutes. So are there any other questions from the audience in the room? No. Okay, so I think Henri raises a really great point about, so the UN Security Council could be a good target of for our activism. How, I guess this is a question for the panelists. Where do you see, I mean, we have clearly overwhelming evidence about the impact, especially on the humanitarian side of the operations, and then now with the UNICEF study, we know based on past sanctions regimes, the impact on the people of Iraq. We also have, you know, overwhelming evidence from the North Korean side. So how do you see potentially a global campaign to push back on these sanctions, and instead of calling for maximum pressure, calling for maximum engagement? So maybe this is an opportunity for all the speakers to maybe come up and offer any closing remarks. And because we, after, at the end of this session, we will actually close the Zoom and the Facebook, but those of us that are gathered, about 20 of us in the room, will continue to have the discussion, especially with the UN officials that will be joining us. So maybe we'll start with Doug coming up and offering some wisdom. So thank you.
Thank you. I do believe that this is really a critical time. We are at a time when, at the initiative of the South Koreans, the joint military exercises have been postponed. And interestingly enough, when something positive was done, as opposed to negative sanctions, there was a response. And the North Korean response to the positive initiative of the South Koreans was, yes, we would like to come to the Olympics. We would like to engage in dialogue. I think a good argument could be made that sanctions have been on actually since US sanctions since the beginning of the Korean War. or the end of the armistice, and have been utterly unsuccessful. And initiatives that were done for positive initiatives, like deferring joint military exercises, brought forward an immediate positive response. It seems to me that during this period of time, when we do not have military exercises taking place, we do not have North Korean missile launches taking place, this is a time to propose and do as many people-to-people projects, as much engagement as possible. And I know that the Mennonite Central Committee is sending a delegation that will be in 2 weeks arriving in North Korea to further explore the projects that they could do together. I'm working with a number of doctors who want to meet with North Korean doctors to talk about, to publicly talk about the medical consequences of a nuclear war and how it'd be horrible for all of the people. So I think this is really a time of let 1,000 flowers bloom. We need to work as quickly as we can during this period of peaceful competition in the Olympics.
Rights and international law more generally always has been organized people power, and that there are no shortcuts to that. So we need to sort of pull out the best strategies that we have based on our own histories of activism and on solidarity with people who are mobilizing around the world right now. Is really the root of the threat and the most accessible administration that we can impact those of us who are here. And you know, it's a combination of old-fashioned kind of organizing and the sort of like public education that we need to do. And we need to, I think, sort of pull out some of the questions that are implicit and not really being problematized by the media. We know, for example, anybody in the United States has plenty of access to information about human rights violations committed by the North Korean government against their own people. However, we need to be talking to people about the fact that whatever the human rights record of that government, that is not the reason that the US is threatening North Korea. And unless we challenge that implication, we're going to be moving in circles and allowing the logic of the administration to preside. You know, all of us could go around the table right now and list dozens of US allies, not to mention the US itself, who are governments who have terrible human rights records. So those things are not mutually exclusive. And I think that there are, you know, that's sort of the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot of ways in which the story that most people in the US are hearing about North Korea and the US response needs to be challenged. And we can do that together through all of our organizations.
Andre and Kevin.
So as for the legal avenues, basically, or the mechanisms that allow challenges of the sanctions, of course, the primary responsibility for challenging the sanctions goes to the North Korean government that has at its disposition, for instance, the right to be consulted by the Security Council if there is special economic hardship that comes from the sanctions. You can also start a case at the ICJ, although for the reasons I mentioned, I'm not optimistic about that. It has also sent a letter to the UN Secretary General to review the legality of sanctions. To my knowledge, the Office of Legal Affairs has not responded to that letter. But for external actors, one possibility is writing a letter to the UN Security Council. I'm not exactly sure to what extent Those letters to the Security Council I actually read, but it is one avenue. One other avenue, and probably more efficient, is to write to the 1718 Committee on sanctions, which in this case, evidence of the impact of sanctions on North Koreans would be particularly helpful. And of course, there can always be a recourse to writing to the Secretary General. So those are basically the legal avenues or the points of contact that would come to my mind for further action, basically. Thank you.
I'm not really sure what I can add to all those very excellent suggestions. I could perhaps just reiterate the point that I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in trying to get public support behind this is really the very serious lack of knowledge that the ordinary people, the public, have about North Korea. That the image that people have of North Korea is one that's created by the mainstream media, and that frames the way that a lot of people think about the country. And I think an awareness campaign about North Korea and countering that narrative is absolutely crucial. I think there's some leverage also within the UN Security Council resolutions, as I mentioned. There are articles that clearly state that the resolutions are not meant to have negative humanitarian impacts, where when they have other articles within the resolutions that clearly trying to do exactly that. So I think, you know, using the arguments that the resolutions put forward themselves against the resolutions may be one fruitful way forward. But also, you know, just as I say, public awareness, even for sanctions advocates who tend to think of sanctions, and many of them do think that they are a peaceful alternative to war. But as we draw attention to what their impact is, then we can counter that narrative. You know, drawing attention to the case of Iraq and what happened there, and countering the notion, and you actually see this in the UN resolutions themselves, that they try to justify the resolutions by saying that there are great unneeds of the people, and the North Korean government has failed to secure the livelihood of the North Korean people. And one of the arguments you often hear from sanctions advocates is that, well, if there is suffering in North Korea, that's the fault of the government, that's not the fault of the UN Security Council, which I think is a very problematic argument. It doesn't really work in the case of so-called collateral damage in war, and it shouldn't work in the case of sanctions. So trying to counter that argument about responsibility as well. But I think more public awareness about North Korea is and not leaving it to the mainstream media is a crucial way forward. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, Doug, did you want to say something else? And then we'll give the last word to Ye-Jung.
Yeah, I did want to mention that there will be a special meeting of the Security Council on February 26th, which will be discussing the 1718 Sanctions Committee against North Korea. And I would encourage organizations and others to communicate directly with Ambassador Karl van Oosterom, the ambassador from the Netherlands, who is the chair of the 1718 Sanctions Committee on North Korea, and let him know before then that there is grave concern about the way in which sanctions are affecting the children and other vulnerable populations in North Korea, and also the way in which sanctions are harming and providing obstacles to humanitarian organizations and people-to-people organizations that are actually trying to solve the relationships and help the people in North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Doug. That's, I think, really a great concrete thing that we can do together. And lastly, we're going to close out with hearing from Yejung from South Korea, some closing words and recommendations for what a global campaign can do together.
Thank you. Actually, today I focused on people-to-people engagement, but I think actually we need two tracks. So of course, we need to enhance people-to-people engagement and cooperation with North Korea, but we also need to touch fundamental things such as officially end the Korean War and peace treaty, peace agreement. You know, bigger systemic change can help to increase people-to-people engagement, and it will lead to sustainable peace. So actually, I guess just tackling only the sanctions issue, it can be maybe not that enough. Maybe we should touch the fundamental issues such as peace treaty. So that's my final remark. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Yejung. And thank you to all of our fabulous panelists and to all of you, the hundreds of you listening, watching on Facebook and Zoom. Am I on mute? Oh, shoot. Okay, sorry about this. This has been a very funky technical system here, but we've done the best that we can. Just to reiterate that we will get this video feed up onto YouTube, and we hope that everybody that has been watching it can share it. So we need to proliferate this knowledge and let the world know that the maximum pressure is hurting innocent lives, and that we have to, as a global community, respond and push back and call for maximum engagement. So thank you. We will end our session here, and we'll be in touch with you, Yejung. Bye-bye. Thank you for the audience.